We have some questions now. Janet will go around with the microphone. Raise your hand if you have a question. No speeches.
Okay.
Just a quick question.
Quick question. Okay, your name?
Jerry Manicata. Mr. Kristol, this week Obama came out with a sort of a proclamation that he would back the Palestinian resolution in the UN, which is frightening to me that a president would come out against an ally like that. What is your opinion on that? And is this just political rhetoric?
No, I think he really, he didn't say it exactly. He had sent out people to indicate that he was somewhat happy about things Netanyahu had said, I guess. I don't know what else has motivated this change. Or maybe just someone happy that Netanyahu got himself reelected, came from behind in a pretty impressive way. That he's now going to change our position on a very fundamental issue, on whether there is right now the conditions, whether there are right now the conditions for a Palestinian state next to Israel. This is crazy, and this is a case where the Congress can really step up and do some things to stop the U.S. government at the UN and stop the UN from moving on this, I think.
Okay.
Congress controls the purse strings. Netanyahu said, as long as I'm prime minister, there won't be a Palestinian state. What I think he meant to say, which is a perfectly common sense statement, is with Hamas controlling Gaza, with PLO, with PA in the West Bank not ready to really assume serious authority, with no ability to guarantee that ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all kinds of other Hamas and Hezbollah won't spill over into these areas, Israel cannot accept, and no one should accept.
Okay, let's move on to our next question. And your name?
My name is Ray Hameson. Good afternoon, Mr. Kristol. Quick question. You mentioned Hillary, obviously 2016, and right now the email thing is on everybody's mind. I've heard two conflicting stories. Ed Klein is saying Bauer and Jarrett's behind it because they hate the Clintons, and other people, conspiracy theorists, are basically saying that they're trying to make it not to be Hillary, to not be Obama's third term. I'd like to know whether you subscribe to either of those theories, and if you think it's going to have a big impact on 2016 at all?
I think it could have an impact. Well, how do we know about the emails? It's an important lesson in this. I'll just take 1 minute to say. We know about these emails from the Benghazi Committee, chaired by Trey Gowdy. What was, for the last 2, 3, 4 months, what's been the most conventional, established wisdom about Benghazi, including among a lot of conservative pundits and some Republican operatives? It's old news, it's a Fox News obsession, we got to get off that, no one cares about it. I give the House Republicans a lot of credit, and Trey Gowdy a lot of credit for saying, wait a second, we've got to investigate this. And Gowdy investigated it, and they discovered something kind of important, which is Hillary Clinton was running her own email system on her own server with her own domain while she was Secretary of State. That raises very fundamental questions, I think, of propriety, legality, also the security of those emails, and that'll have to be investigated. But it's a good example what Gowdy did and what Cotton did with a letter to the Iranian leaders and what Netanyahu has done. It's a good example that you have to be tough and not get spooked when 2 columnists in the New York Times and 3 Republican consultants and 1 pollster say, ooh, this is a little controversial, or some people don't think this is very nice. You got to stick to your principles, and I give the House Republicans credit for doing so. We learned something pretty important.
Okay, next question.
My name is Charlie. You mentioned that there's a limited amount that Congress can do to stop the president, especially in foreign policy. Well, our founders created 3 branches of government to limit powers, and the first branch of government they eliminated the Constitution is the legislature. So I wonder, why do you say that? Do you mean that they don't have the power, or they're not willing to use it?
No, I just mean that there are only 54 Republicans in the Senate, and you need 60 votes to get things passed, and more importantly, you need 67 votes in the Senate and 290 in the House to overturn a veto. So I'm just making a practical comment that a tough president, with a party that's willing to go with him in Congress, can give the president quite a lot of latitude in foreign policy, obviously, and to some degree in domestic policy. At least he can force kind of a deadlock, and the media is with the president, and our guys don't always manage these situations perfectly, so he tends to get about half of what he wants. So no, I agree that if things were different, maybe you could make more advances. Maybe we will be able to make more advances, but it's tough for the president to do this. Here's one thing, though, I do think where you all can play a role. Take Iran. There are 2 Democratic senators from New York. Chuck Schumer says he's the guardian of Israel, he's the shomer of Israel. This is the moment. You cannot be a friend of Israel, honestly, a guardian of Israel, and accept this Iranian deal. You shouldn't accept it for the sake of the U.S. either.
Yeah.
But you can't accept it. It's amazing how loyal the Democrats have been to Obama. I really don't even fully understand it myself. They don't like him personally, but they, I think, are threatened by their own left-wing base, some of their left-wing donors, And they have just stuck with him on all kinds of issues where they know better, whether it's Keystone or some of the foreign policy issues. But this is one where, and I have a decent relationship with Chuck Schumer, so I don't mean to single him out, but where Schumer and Gillibrand and others really need to be called, called up and said, and you guys can help do it publicly, and say, okay, are you really just going to go with the president on something that's so manifestly bad for the country and bad for our ally Israel?
Okay. We have time for just a couple more questions. And your name?
My name is Peter Steuben. I'm with the Rockaway Republicans. Thank you so much for coming to Queens. In the 60s, I grew up, high school, college in the 60s. Many of the youth were very active, in fact, rabid against violence and war, and their focus was on Vietnam at the time. Today, we're finding many youth around the world, educated youth, going to the Middle East to fight for war and the worst atrocities of war. Do you see problems there, or what is your feeling about this momentum that seems to be taking place?
I'd say two things. I mean, obviously, in Western Europe in particular, those countries have not done a very good job of assimilating their immigrants. Maybe they shouldn't have taken as many in the first place, but whatever, their policies haven't worked very well. So there are lots of young people who get disillusioned or are recruited pretty easily by very bad people, the Imams and others, and they end up, unfortunately, going off and killing others and getting themselves killed often. I do think, though, we should not, so that's a big problem, and no one has an easy solution to that, obviously. That's a sort of deeper problem about the West and immigration and our civilization versus Islamist extremism and so forth. But there's a more practical thing. This was not happening 5 or 6 years ago, 7, 8 years ago. Whatever the problems of Bush's foreign policy, whatever the mistakes we made in Iraq before the surge, they were not recruiting a lot of Westerners to come fight against us in Iraq, or to fight even against us or others in Afghanistan or anywhere else. Now, why was that? Because deep down, they were losing. They knew they were losing. I mean, we had some setbacks, but it was pretty clear that they were not winning after 9/11, the war on terror. That is not clear today. And there is nothing, bin Laden was right about this. Strong horse. The strong horse can recruit. People go to the strong horse, not the weak horse. And the terrible thing of what's happened in the last 2-3 years is we look weak, they look strong, and if you're a sort of disturbed, disillusioned, unhappy 19-year-old somewhere, you can convince yourself that this is the way of the future, just the way kids convince themselves, otherwise normal German kids in 1932, or, if you met them on the street, were just living normal lives in Berlin or Dusseldorf, normal kids elsewhere in the world joined communist parties and participated in all kinds of terrible things. People will get recruited if they think it's the way of the future. It's just another reason why it's so important. If we can get them on the defensive, I think a lot of this recruitment would diminish. It wouldn't go away, but it would diminish.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions.
Hello, I'm Robert. I'm 15 years old. There's a growing problem in the Middle East with ISIS, and I'm 15, so there's a possibility of a draft by the time the next election, I can be eligible for it. I'm just wondering, what would the Republicans' foreign policy be in order for me not to be drafted? And Iran has been doing mock bombings of U.S. carriers, so why hasn't anyone been hearing of that? Thank you.
I think the best way not to have a draft is to make sure that the volunteer army, which has been a huge success, is satisfactorily manned and equipped. And so let's make sure we have a strong, adequately sized and resourced volunteer army. And let's make sure we handle a lot of these problems early, rather than letting them get out of control, and then you do get a World War II or something terrible, Korea, Vietnam, and you do have to have a draft. But I don't think that's really, I'm not in principle against, everyone serving in many ways, but I think if you talk to military leaders, they're happy to have a volunteer army, just make sure that it's adequately manned and adequately resourced. I mean, there has been a real attempt on the part of this administration not to publicize what Iran is doing, because they want desperate. I think if you really could wake up President Obama in the middle of the night, it's kind of a horrifying thought, but anyway, and say, what do you really want in your second term? You got Obamacare in his first term. They've said that what they want is the equivalent in foreign policy to Obamacare is the Iran deal. That's the big kind of transformative thing. The other thing I think you get, and so that's why no talk about what Iran is doing. No talk about the sponsorship of terrorism, the killing of Americans in Iraq and elsewhere, what they're doing at the borders of Israel. That's all been covered over. The other thing this president, I think, always dreamt of because he wanted to be the president who presided at the creation of a Palestinian state. And this explains, I think, the antagonism in part to Netanyahu. He had a deep conviction that this was an injustice in 1948. I don't think he wants Israel to go away, but he wants Israel to go back to very limited borders, which I think would be very dangerous, and that there should be a Palestinian state. He would be sort of the Palestinian state, what Harry Truman was to the creation of the Israeli state. And he's deeply bitter that that's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen not because of Israel, but because of the Palestinians and Hamas, and what's happening now in the Middle East has made it more, not more further away as a prospect, not closer, unfortunately, really. But that's the fact, and that's what Netanyahu is saying. And I think he's so bitter that he's not going to have that achievement that he is now lashing out at Israel.
And for our final question, your name?
Hi, Lorraine, Nassau County Federation of Republican Women. Tell me, on Friday, March the 20th, the UN declared Israel as the biggest affront to women's rights. Tell me your thoughts.
It's kind of a tough question, you know. I have to carefully balance both sides of that. Look, this is a good example. So we joined the UN, this is some subsidiary of the UN Human Rights Council. Bush suspended our membership in the UN Human Rights Council. Condoleezza Rice did because it was such a joke. We rejoined it at the beginning of the Obama administration. Secretary Clinton, the Secretary of State, she's on tape, you can see it, saying, we're rejoining it. Now it's a test. We're tough-minded, we're not suckers. If this thing does not perform itself, we reserve the right to get out of there. It's six plus years later. The thing is as much of a joke and farce as it ever has been. The Obama administration is doing nothing to get out of there. But this is a case where Congress does control the purse strings, and Congress can cut off funding, U.S. funding at least, to the UN Human Rights Council. And I do suspect that may happen this year, and let the president defend this council where a Sudanese and a Saudi Arabian preside over a meeting where they condemn Israeli violations, I suppose, of human rights, women's rights. The UN really is farcical, and I've become radicalized on this personally. When I was a kid, there was kind of a right-wing thing that people like us thought was a little crazy. U.S. out of the UN, UN out of the U.S. But I gotta say, I kind of think that's a reasonable idea.